The Chinese colonel stepped over the rope line and barked, "Salute me, soldier!" But the royal guard didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't move. In front of tourists, officers, and an entire embassy delegation, he stood his ground. And what happened next turned a diplomatic visit into an international embarrassment. Now, before we reveal the full story, press that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The morning mist hung over London like a grey wool blanket, settling into the ancient stones of Whitehall until the very air seemed to carry weight. At Horse Guards Parade, tourists clustered behind velvet ropes, their excited chatter mixing with the distant rumble of black cabs and the sharp click of heels on wet pavement. Camera phones were already out, expectant hands gripping them like rosaries as visitors waited for the ceremony to begin. It was one of those London mornings where the sky couldn't decide between rain and sunshine, so it chose neither, leaving everything suspended between storm and calm. Among the Household Division guards standing at ceremonial attention, Lance Corporal James Harland cut an imposing figure. 43 years old, with the weathered face of a man who'd served through more than parades, Harland stood rock steady in his scarlet tunic. The bearskin cap added nearly a foot to his height, while his rifle rested at the perfect angle against his white-gloved hands. But if tourists saw only the pageantry, they missed the real story. Behind Harland's ceremonial stillness lived memories of Afghan dust and Belfast tension, combat experiences that had forged his discipline. His eyes, fixed forward in the traditional 1,000-yard stare, held the quiet authority of a soldier who'd led men through firefights and brought them home alive. The convoy appeared around the corner, 6 diplomatic vehicles, Chinese flags crisp on their hoods despite the damp air. The lead car slid to a stop with practiced precision. Out stepped Colonel Wei Zhou. 52 years old, lean and sharp-featured, with aviator sunglasses that stayed perfectly positioned despite the overcast sky. His dress blues were immaculate, ribbons from Tibet and Vietnam border operations arranged in perfect rows. Zhou moved with the confidence of a career officer. His promotion to colonel had come through leadership during a Sino-Indian border standoff, where his decisions prevented escalation. Today, however, he wasn't on a mountain. He was in London, and the terrain was entirely different. Colonel Zhou, the British protocol officer, stepped forward. Captain Marcus Fleming, descendant of a long line of military diplomats who'd been smoothing over international tensions since the Crimea. He extended a hand with practiced efficiency. "Welcome to Horse Guards Parade. The ceremony begins in precisely 7 minutes. Zhou's handshake was firm, almost challenging, lasting just a fraction too long to be purely diplomatic. "I understand this changing of the guard is quite the spectacle," he said, his English accented but crisp. "Though I must say, we do things differently in Beijing." The British officer smiled politely, the kind of smile that had diffused 1,000 potential incidents over 30 years of service. "Each tradition has its own character, sir. I think you will find our approach rather unique." Zhou circled slowly, studying Harland like a tactical diagram. "Yes," he mused, removing his sunglasses. "Character indeed." Something in his tone made Captain Fleming's diplomatic antennae twitch, but protocol demanded he continue the scheduled tour. What happened next started small, the way most diplomatic incidents do. As the ceremony preparations continued, Zhou moved closer to the rope barrier, his entourage trailing behind like nervous ducklings. He studied Harland with the analytical eye of a commander assessing troops, circling slowly as if conducting a personal inspection. Other tourists stepped aside automatically, sensing the weight of authority radiating from the Chinese officer. "These guards," he announced to his delegation, voice carrying across the morning air, "they're like statues, aren't they? All ceremony, no substance." The comment was delivered in Mandarin, but loud enough that several tourists with translation apps caught the meaning. A few British visitors exchanged uncomfortable glances. The British protocol officer stiffened slightly but maintained diplomatic silence. Fleming had seen this kind of thing before, foreign military personnel testing boundaries. Joe continued his circuit, examination growing more deliberate. "These ceremonial postings," he said, switching to English now, apparently for the benefit of listening tourists. "We abolished them after liberation. Too much focus on appearance, not enough on combat readiness." He paused directly in front of Harland, close enough that condensation from his breath would have been visible in colder weather. "Tell me, does your guardsman here even know I'm a colonel?" Captain Fleming stepped forward carefully, his movements calculated to be firm without being confrontational. "The guards follow very specific protocols, Colonel. During ceremonial duty, they maintain position regardless of who approaches. It's a tradition dating back centuries." "Tradition," Joe interrupted, the word leaving his mouth like something distasteful. "Yes, I'm familiar with your traditions, but surely even traditions adapt to modern military courtesy." "The chain of command here runs through the Crown," Fleming explained patiently, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd given this explanation dozens of times. "During ceremonial duty, nothing supersedes that. Not foreign rank, not personal requests, not even our own generals outside specific protocol." Joe's expression darkened, storm clouds gathering behind his eyes. "Are you telling me," he said slowly, deliberately, each word weighted with disbelief, "that your man won't acknowledge basic military courtesy? That he'll ignore a senior officer of an allied military? I'm telling you that his duty requires him to maintain his post," Fleming replied, still calm, but with an edge of steel creeping into his voice. "It's not personal, Colonel, it's protocol." And that's when everything changed. Joe stepped across the rope barrier with casual arrogance. The British officers immediately tensed, while tourists' cameras swiveled toward the drama. "Guardsmen!" Joe's voice cracked like a whip across the parade ground, the command tone honed through decades of giving orders that were never questioned. "I am addressing you as a senior officer of an allied military. Face me and render appropriate respect." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the morning traffic seemed to hold its breath. Harland remained perfectly still, his breathing maintained its ceremonial rhythm. His grip on the rifle didn't shift. The silence stretched like a rubber band ready to snap. "You dishonor your uniform," Joe continued, his voice rising to carry across the entire square. "In Beijing, when a colonel gives a command, soldiers obey. This isn't British tradition, it's insubordination dressed up as ceremony." A ripple of movement passed through the crowd. Some tourists looked genuinely concerned, wondering if they were witnessing an international incident. Others continued filming, recognizing that whatever was happening was historic enough to capture. Captain Fleming took a step forward, his military bearing now fully engaged. "Colonel Joe, you must return behind the barrier immediately. You are disrupting an official ceremony and violating diplomatic protocol." Joe moved closer to Harland, now within arm's reach. The power play was obvious. This was about proving a point. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you, soldier," Joe demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that somehow carried farther than his shouting. "That's not a request. It's an order from a superior officer." The crowd held its collective breath. Even the ceremonial band, positioned some 50 yards away, seemed to pause between notes. "Your silence means nothing," Joe declared, turning slightly to address the wider audience now, his voice taking on the rehearsed cadence of someone who'd given this lecture before. "You're not displaying strength, you're simply failing to show basic military respect. In any real army, this kind of behavior would be grounds for immediate discipline." Still, Harland didn't move, not a muscle, not a breath out of place. Joe's face flushed. His hands moved restlessly as he gestured toward Harland. "This," he announced to the gathered crowd, gesturing toward Harland like a professor at a particularly disappointing exhibit, "is what British power has become. Soldiers who stand like mannequins while real military men pass by. No wonder your empire crumbled. You've confused stillness with strength." The insult hit its mark. A murmur rippled through the British tourists. Some looked uncomfortable, others actively angered. A retired Royal Navy officer, identifiable by his regimental tie, stepped closer with a grim expression. "Colonel!" Fleming's voice carried real authority now, the diplomatic veneer cracking to reveal the steel underneath. "You are creating a diplomatic incident. British security forces are authorized to remove any individual disrupting official ceremonies." Joe's eyes flashed dangerously. "A diplomatic incident? I am asking for basic military courtesy." He spun back to face Harland, moving even closer, his intention clear, to provoke some reaction, any reaction that would validate his point. "I'll ask you once more, soldier," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command that had moved battalions across hostile terrain. "I am Colonel Wei Zhou, People's Liberation Army, decorated veteran of 3 armed conflicts. Salute me as you would any superior officer." The command hung in the air like smoke, visible, choking, impossible to ignore. Every eye in Horse Guards parade fixed on James Harland. Harland had been through moments like this before. He'd stood under fire in Kandahar. He'd maintained position during bomb threats. He'd held formation during the Queen's funeral. His discipline was deeper, a contract written in blood and honour, forged in places where standing your ground meant the difference between life and death. So he remained still, not out of disrespect, but because his oath was to something bigger than ego or politics. British security closed in with practiced efficiency. The embassy's chief of protocol appeared at Joe's elbow, whispering urgent Mandarin about diplomatic consequences. "Unbelievable," Joe muttered, then louder, "absolutely unbelievable." He stepped back, straightening his uniform. "This isn't military discipline, this is theatre." He turned to his entourage, his voice taking on the clipped cadence of someone delivering a final assessment. "We are finished here. Clearly, British military courtesy has evolved beyond recognition." As he marched back toward his convoy, the crowd parted like water. Captain Fleming moved immediately to manage the aftermath, his diplomatic training kicking into overdrive as he began quietly reassuring other international observers and British officials who had gathered during the commotion. And throughout it all, James Harland remained at attention, eyes forward, rifle steady, because sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. The motorcade pulled away from Horse Guards with more haste than their arrival had displayed, diplomatic flags snapping in the morning breeze. Inside the lead vehicle, Colonel Wei Zhou stared straight ahead, his jaw working silently as he processed what had just occurred. His aide ventured carefully, "The British protocols are quite rigid, Colonel." "Rigid?" Joe's voice was sharp. "That wasn't rigidity, that was deliberate disrespect." "Perhaps we should submit a formal inquiry," suggested the embassy's chief of protocol. "No complaints, I won't give them the satisfaction." The aide made a note on his tablet. "Shall I include recommendations for future interactions?" Joe was quiet for a long moment. "Include everything," he finally said. "I refuse to believe that Guard was simply following orders." The convoy continued toward the embassy, carrying a colonel whose worldview had just collided with something he hadn't expected. A wall built not of stone or steel, but of unshakable principle. Back at Wellington Barracks that evening, the changing room buzzed with familiar sounds. But tonight, the conversation had an edge to it. James Harland sat on the wooden bench, peeling off his white gloves. "Bloke really tried to order you about like you were his personal squaddy?" Lance Corporal Wicks asked, perched on the bench across from Harland. At 26, Wicks was still young enough to be amazed by the kinds of situations veteran guards took in stride. Harland paused in his routine, pulling his civilian jacket from the locker. "He did, and you just stood there like stone." Private Mills chimed in from his own locker. "Even when he got right in your face." "That was the job," Harland replied simply. The youngest guard in the company, barely out of training, looked genuinely puzzled. "But he was a colonel, wasn't he? I mean, isn't saluting a senior officer kind of basic?" A couple of the older soldiers chuckled. Some lessons couldn't be taught in basic training. Harland paused in his routine, turning to face the younger man with patient expression. "Tell me something," he said, voice carrying the gentle authority that reminded everyone why veteran NCOs made the best teachers. "When you took your oath, who did you swear it to?" "The Crown, Corporal," the young soldier answered immediately, his back automatically straightening as he spoke the words. "Exactly." Harlan nodded. "Not to every colonel who feels entitled to a salute. Not to foreign officers who think they understand our protocols." He folded his civilian shirt with precision. "We stand where we stand, for a reason that goes deeper than courtesy or international relations." The room fell quiet. These men had served with Harland in active zones. They knew he wasn't talking theory. "My grandfather stood guard at Buckingham Palace during the Blitz," Harland continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing family history that carried real lessons. "German bombs falling, buildings burning, people screaming and running past his post. He didn't move, not to help, not to take cover, not even when a piece of shrapnel opened a gash in his leg that would leave him with a limp for life." He pulled on his civilian shoes, the mundane action contrasting with the gravity of his words. "That's what guard duty means. It's not about individual requests or ego matches. It's about representing something larger than yourself, something that's been maintained through plague, war, peacetime, and whatever other tests history throws at us. Besides," he added, a slight grin finally breaking across his weathered face, "you should have seen the look on his face when I didn't even blink. Priceless." That broke the tension, sending ripples of laughter through the changing room. But beneath the humour, every man there understood the deeper message. They'd all faced moments requiring that same discipline, maybe not on parade grounds, but in places where holding your ground meant everything. "Anyone else would have cracked," Wicks observed, "especially with all those tourists watching, cameras rolling." "That's exactly when you don't crack," Harland corrected gently. "When everyone's watching is when discipline matters most. In combat, you have adrenaline to help you. In ceremonial duty, you've got nothing but training and will." He stood, checking his civilian appearance, with the same attention to detail he'd shown in uniform. "Some things are bigger than rank. Some responsibilities transcend personal comfort or diplomatic nicety, and sometimes doing nothing is the hardest duty of all." As he prepared to leave, Corporal Matthews, who'd served alongside Harland in Helmand, spoke up. "The colonel didn't just disrespect the uniform, did he? He disrespected what it represents." Harland paused at the door, considering the observation. "I don't think he understood what it represents," he said finally. "That's not disrespect. That's ignorance. There's a difference." With that, he stepped out into the London evening, leaving behind a room full of men who understood they served something deeper than treaties or protocols, something that would outlast politicians and withstand the tests of time. Later that night, as Harland sat in his Camden flat, his mobile buzzed with a text from his old Sergeant Major. "Saw the footage online. Well done. RSM Blackthorn." Harland typed back, "Roger that, Sergeant Major." His thoughts drifted to a dusty checkpoint outside Kandahar, to young Private Thompson who'd panicked under fire, to the patient hours spent teaching that discipline wasn't about being a robot, it was about doing the right thing even when every instinct screamed otherwise. He remembered Thompson asking, his voice shaky with post-combat adrenaline, "But what if I'd been wrong to hold position? What if someone had died because I didn't move?" "That's the weight of the job," Harland had told him then, the same truth he'd shown Joe today. "You don't get to decide which orders matter and which don't. You don't get to salute the threats you like and ignore the ones you don't. You stand where you're told to stand, and you trust that the system, imperfect as it is, serves something larger than any individual moment." Thompson had gone on to earn the Military Cross for actions that saved 3 civilian contractors during a Taliban rocket attack. He'd stayed in position, returned fire with precision, and called in support exactly as trained. His phone buzzed again, his sister. Mum saw you on the news. Are you okay? Harlan smiled, typing back. All good. Tell Mum not to worry. I was doing exactly what I should have been doing. As he finished his tea, he thought about tomorrow's shift. Tourists would come and go. Diplomatic visits would continue their scheduled rotations. And somewhere, someone else would undoubtedly test the boundaries of British ceremonial protocol. And he'd be ready. Because that's what guards did. They stood ready. The next morning, as news of the incident rippled through diplomatic channels, reactions were decidedly mixed, but far more complex than simple cultural misunderstanding. The British press, initially treating it as a curiosity, diplomatic dust-up at Horse Guards, quickly discovered there was more to the story when military affairs correspondents began receiving background information from their sources. The Chinese colonel in the Guard Gate incident, read the headline in the Telegraph's defence section, has history of boundary testing in previous postings. The article went on to detail Colonel Zhou's record of similar incidents in Washington, D.C., where he'd attempted to observe a classified Marine Corps training exercise, and in Tokyo, where he'd been caught photographing Japanese self-defense force equipment during what was supposed to be a ceremonial visit. Meanwhile, the Chinese embassy released a carefully worded statement about cultural misunderstandings that neither confirmed nor denied the specifics of what had occurred. The statement emphasized mutual respect between Allied military forces, while subtly suggesting that British ceremonial protocols might be due for modernization. But within military circles around the globe, the story took on a completely different tone. An American Marine colonel posted a Twitter thread. Any military professional who's served with Her Majesty's finest knows the Queen's Guard don't salute outside their chain of command during ceremonial duty. Period. It's discipline. #unmoved, unbroken. The thread went viral, garnering thousands of retweets from military personnel worldwide. Australian SAS veterans shared their own stories of standing alongside British forces, noting the same unwavering commitment to protocol they'd witnessed in combat zones from Afghanistan to Sierra Leone. "I've seen Brit guards hold position under mortar fire," posted one Australian soldier. "Trust me, a grumpy colonel isn't going to shake them." Even some Chinese military personnel, speaking anonymously to international defence forums, acknowledged the misunderstanding. One former PLA officer, posting under a pseudonym, wrote, "Every military has ceremonial protocols. Our own honour guards at Tiananmen Square follow similar rules. This wasn't about rank, it was about role. Big difference." But perhaps the most telling reaction came from within Britain's own military community. The Household Division's official social media accounts remained professionally silent, but individual service members weren't bound by the same restrictions. A video surfaced of a Canadian guard at Rideau Hall standing motionless while a tourist's child pulled on his tunic, only moving when the child appeared to be in actual danger. "This is what real discipline looks like," the caption read. "Not moving doesn't mean not caring. It means understanding your role completely." More videos followed from around the world. Finnish guards in Arctic conditions, Greek EV zones during thunderstorms, Israeli honour guards through desert sandstorms, US Marines at Arlington Cemetery in blizzards, ice forming on their rifles as they stood vigil. The hashtag #RealDiscipline trended globally within days, accumulating millions of views and thousands of comments from veterans worldwide. Former soldiers from dozens of nations shared personal stories explaining the crucial connection between ceremonial discipline and combat effectiveness, many detailing how parade ground training directly saved lives in actual warfare. "People think guards are statues until they need them to be soldiers," read one popular comment from a former US Special Forces operator. Then they realise these are the same people who hold battlefield positions under direct fire while wounded comrades are evacuated. Same discipline, different application. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. Sir James Henderson, former brigadier of the Household Division and now professor of military history at King's College London, published an op-ed in The Guardian that was picked up by international publications. The incident at Horse Guards reveals a fundamental misunderstanding, not just of British military tradition, but of the nature of discipline itself. Colonel Joe saw inflexibility where he should have recognised the highest form of military bearing. I commanded the Household Division for 8 years. During that time, I watched guardsmen hold positions through terrorist threats, natural disasters and personal medical emergencies. Their immobility isn't stubbornness, it's the manifestation of a contract that transcends individual discomfort or external pressure. The guardsman who stood unmoved yesterday was demonstrating the same quality that allows soldiers to hold defensive positions under artillery fire, maintain unit cohesion during chaotic evacuations, and stay at their posts when every instinct screams, "Run." This isn't about nationalism or cultural superiority. It's about understanding that true military discipline, the kind that saves lives and wins battles, is built on countless small acts of will practiced daily, whether on parade grounds or battlefields. The op-ed became required reading at military academies worldwide, connecting ceremonial traditions to operational effectiveness in ways that transcended national boundaries. Meanwhile, Colonel Wei Zhou returned to Beijing with a story that would follow him for years, not as a tale of British disrespect, but as a reminder that some traditions run deeper than rank, deeper than nationality, deeper than ego. His official report to the Ministry of Defence was measured and professional, noting the different interpretational approaches to military protocol he had observed, but those who knew him reported a change in his approach to similar ceremonies after London, a newfound wariness when travelling among allies with different traditions. Whether humbled or merely more cautious, Zhou began consulting with cultural attachés before attending foreign military ceremonies. His subsequent visits to other allied nations proceeded without incident, suggesting he'd learned something valuable at Horse Guards, even if he'd never publicly acknowledged what that was. And in London, James Harland continued to stand his post, as thousands of guards had before him, and as thousands would after him. Because some duties transcend the moment. Some responsibilities outlast the uniform. And some victories are won by simply refusing to move. The following week, a quiet ceremony took place at Wellington Barracks. No cameras were present, no tourists gathered to witness it. Just soldiers recognising one of their own. Captain Fleming, the protocol officer who had managed the Zhou incident, presented Harland with a commendation for upholding the highest standards of ceremonial discipline under unusual pressure. As Harland accepted the ribbon, Fleming added something off the record. The ambassador sent word. Several foreign attachés have inquired about proper protocols for their upcoming visits. Seems someone learned his lesson. Harland simply nodded, his expression unchanged. Later, stowing the commendation in his locker, he reflected that the real victory hadn't been in the commendation itself. It had been in the countless tourists who'd witnessed the exchange and walked away with a deeper understanding of what the uniform represented. The emails said it all. Now I understand why you guys take this so seriously. My father was military. He always said the hardest thing was standing still. I get it now. That guard showed more strength by not moving than most people show in a lifetime. Those messages, tucked away in his personal files, meant more than any official recognition. Because at the end of the day, that's what it was all about. Not impressing foreign colonels or winning diplomatic points, but embodying principles that might inspire someone somewhere to stand a little stronger when their own moment of testing came. Whether that moment arrived on a parade ground or a battlefield, in a boardroom or a hospital bed, the lesson remained the same. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is exactly what you're supposed to do, no matter who's watching, no matter who's demanding otherwise. That was guard duty. That was service. That was the line between ceremony and chaos, between tradition and expedience, between ego and honour. And tomorrow James Harland would stand it again. What does real discipline look like when someone tries to tear it down? James Harland showed us that sometimes strength means standing still, even when everything around you demands you bend. His response teaches us that true military bearing isn't about flexing authority, it's about knowing exactly who you serve and why that matters more than any individual's ego. Military personnel worldwide recognize the deeper truth. Ceremonial discipline and combat effectiveness aren't opposites. They're manifestations of the same fundamental principles. If this story inspired you to think differently about what strength really looks like, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more tales of the Royal Guard's unshakable discipline. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about real courage in unexpected moments. Share this video with someone who understands that real strength often looks like stillness, whether in uniform or civilian life. The principles demonstrated here apply to anyone who's ever had to stand firm against pressure to abandon their principles. Our other videos about Royal Guards facing impossible tests are appearing on your screen right now. Check them out next. We'll see you tomorrow at the same time with another story that proves when tradition meets pressure, tradition wins every single time.